What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over Lives and Stocks Part 3. This time we're going to be going over reviving characters and players that end up dying, and also bringing the revival platform. And basically we're going to be able to get killed, respawn, and bring in this little platform to respawn on. There you go. And it's that simple. Now there's a few issues, like, for example, we can still lose more than life by hitting more than one blast line. We will have to either disable collision with blast lines or just check to see if we've already hit one and then ignore further collision checks. We also need to figure out what we want to do with the platform. In some cases, the platform rises back up, which we can make happen. In other cases, it just goes fully invisible. Another thing that we need to be careful of is it should be fully intangible, regardless of whether the player's on it or not. For as long as it's here, the enemies and the character that spawned on it should not be able to walk into it like this. They should only be able to sit on it from above, and once they get off, then no one should be able to interact with it. But those things are actually going to come after the next episode, because we are going to be going over invincibility upon respawning, as well as a few other things. So we'll cover that then, because I'm going to use the same technique for the invincibility on the characters that I do for the intangibility of the platform. Or I guess the intangible traits of the platform. So anyway, for now, we're aware of those three issues, but this is still going to accomplish everything we want to do for today, and then we'll clean them up in the next episode when we go over things more related to those bugs. Alright, so to get started, we do need to make a few adjustments to the code as usual. And I'm going to make some in SSB template character and the SSB template game mode. In SSB template character.h, I scroll down to where I had all my functions, and I made a new function called void respawn. It is blueprint callable for me, but again, I just do that kind of as a safeguard just in case I'll need it. You can feel free to remove it or use it as needed. But we do need a respawn function. Now I have a respawn function in the character, and I actually have a respawn function in the game mode, believe it or not. The game mode one, I've made a blueprint implementable event. I've made it respawn player, and we pass in the player number. Let me explain the difference here. So when the character is being respawned, they need certain things to happen. For example, it's not in this episode, just due to time and because we're going to do it in the next episode. Then when you respawn, you should be invincible for a bit, as we just talked about. So these are things that can be handled on the character. The game mode doesn't need to be doesn't need to be accessing the character to set their invincibility or to give them a certain amount of time where their collisions are changed, things like that. The character should handle those things. But the game mode should be handling, either when a character has to be respawned, basically anything regarding the revival platform that comes down. It should at least be spawning that object so that object can be put into place. The character doesn't need to spawn that. So I have respawn in my SSB template character, and I have respawn player with the integer player number, just like we did in notify HUD update lives for the game mode. Now, as I've made this a blueprint implementable event, there is no C++ counterpart for the game mode function, but there is for the character function. So we have respawn, so we're going to go down to it. I put it right under lose life, and here we go. In lose life, we had it to where we were losing, we were decrementing a life from our amount of lives. I was getting the game mode, and then I was calling notify HUD update lives. Now, right here is where a few things are going to be changed. So first of all, you do see a new variable in here called can move. If you've watched my other series, this will be very familiar to you, but if you haven't, then basically I like to have a variable that determines if we can move or add or use inputs at the time. So you know, for example, when we're on the respawn platform, there's certain things you might not be able to do, and when you're dead, there's certain things you'll definitely not be able to do. So I have this boolean can move, and can move is, you know, it's a little bit general. You can make as many things off of it, you know, work off of it, like, oh, I can't attack while I can't move, or I can't jump while I can't move, or I just can't move. You know, I can attack and taunt and all that stuff. So you can do as much as you want with this. For me, what I wanted to do is add this boolean, as I said, can move. See it right there. In my character, I set can move to be true, because sure, you know, maybe you have an entrance and you want it to be false by default, but we're not into that sort of thing yet. We're not that far along in the series. So for now, we just always want to be able to move until we die, and that's when I'm going to disable it for a few seconds. So if can move is true in the constructor, I set it to false and lose life. I still subtract the life like we were doing. I still get the game mode and notify the HUD like we were doing. But then I do a check in here. It doesn't really have to be in here, but it's fine to be in here because if the game mode ref fails, then, you know, things have gone bad. So it's up to you. You can also take it out here. I debated this for a bit. It really doesn't matter, though, in this case. Basically, the most important thing is that we want to make sure our lives are greater than 0. If they're 0, we don't want to respawn our character anymore. At this point, they've depleted all their lives. Now, depending on how you want it to look with the HUD and all, you may need to check if it's greater than -1, because 0 could be a valid value if, you know, you have 0 lives left, but you're still alive now. You see what I'm saying? Okay. And then, if we do have more than 0 lives, I'm going to call respawn in the character. And respawn is going to do a lot of the same logic as you can imagine here. Basically, we're going to reset the damage counter. You know, you just respawned. We don't want to keep any of that damage from before, so that gets set back to 0. Reset damage counter is a function we made earlier. I think we made it very early on in the series. And there you go. You can see all we do is set it back to 0. Then I do get the game mode again. You can just literally copy paste this logic right here. But instead of notify HUD, I call respawn player with the player number. Now for the record, it's not bad to do 2 casts here. We're only doing this, you know, whenever a player loses a life and respawns. You could mix these together and put the respawn player logic up here. But I wanted to keep it this way on purpose. So if the character needs to do anything first before the game mode starts handling the respawn, it is good to make sure you at least know the order. So I know that my character's respawn functionality, like how I do reset damage counter, will happen before anything in the game mode's respawn character. Okay, and that's all there is for the code. It's nothing too crazy. It's just some basic functionality that we need to be able to respawn and control when we can move and things like that. And you can go ahead and build solution like usual, or just launch Visual Studio or launch the editor from Visual Studio. That's what I've done here. That's why you can see all this is in like debug view. I go into the engine, and there's 3 blueprints that we're going to be messing with today. So we're going to need to add something to the blast lines. We're going to need to create the revival platform BP. And then we are going to need to edit a few things in the base game mode BP. First things first, let's go ahead and just alter this thing in the blast lines because it's quick. So, if you haven't watched any other episode of this series, now's a good time to do so. If you want to get caught up on, you know, everything we've done, we're on episode 21, I believe, so we are pretty far along. We're getting there, and it's getting more and more advanced every single episode. So, I'll leave the link in the iCard right here, top right corner, to the entire playlist if you want to catch up on the whole series. But if you just care about what we're doing here, the only thing you need to care about right now are the blast lines so that you know where we're coming from. I'll leave that video right here. Okay. And so all I've done, this was already the logic that was in The last episode where basically if the actor begins overlap with the blast line and the actor is a character, then they just lose a life. You know, you can make it a little bit more advanced than that. Like when we get into launchers, you can make it so they have to be launched through it, so they can actually walk through it and things like that. But for now, this is good. And then I've made a new variable of type string, called it blast line type. So plus variable, change the type to be string, and call it whatever you want, like blast line type. So basically, I made a string just to determine if it was left, right, top, or bottom. And it's not necessary you do that, but with the revival platforms, they're supposed to spawn in the middle. And if someone is already spawning on one, then it's supposed to spawn them to, you know, the left or right. I think it's been a long time, but I think the rules are if there's more than 4 players that are spawning at the same time, then the platforms actually start going above each other. So there's a lot of things we can do with that, and I will cover that in more depth. But we do want to have some indicator of where the middle of the stage is. So right now in this episode, it's not going to be perfect because I did not bother changing the blast line locations to try and get the middle of the stage, which is why you can see it's offset a little bit to the left from our point of view. But it is going to be something that we are covering and we do go over, so we might as well add this now regardless. So add the string. You can have the default value as nothing. Then when we go into our level, and you'll have to do this for every level if you decide to go the route I'm going here, you can scroll down the world outliner and find all your blast lines. The one that you select will be highlighted. So I know this is my left blast line from the camera's point of view. So once I click on it, it says default here, blast line type, and I set this to left. This is my right one, so I set it to right. This is my bottom one. I actually am not using it here, but it should be bottom. We just won't use it in today's episode. And then blast line BP4 is top. And these are just good to know. I use both the top and the sides for the revival platform. So I use the top to know where I should start the revival platform from. And I use the sides to know kind of where the middle of the stage is. While we're in here, I can make a minor adjustment and show you how that'll probably make it a little bit smoother. That was the wrong direction. So I'm going to move these both to basically, whoops, there you go, basically like the edge of the stage is here. This could go back just a little bit. There we go, something like that. So now you should be able to see once I play this again. Whoops, gotta go back to my main menu. Yes, we can save it. And so now that I move the blast lines a little bit, so I move them kind of closer together. It's not going to be perfect because I haven't mathematically looked and seen what the middle is and all that. But you should see now that the platform is a lot more in the center of the stage. And that's because the way this is working is I'm using the blast lines to calculate the middle of the stage. Now, alternatively, you know, if you don't like the way your blast lines are looking for the middle, or if you don't like that functionality, you can go ahead and just make an object that tags the middle of the stage. Literally, it can be an invisible object just so we can get its location and spawn objects there or around it. They're both equally good ways. I just wanted to show you this way because I felt like, you know, if the blast lines work, it will save you some time and effort. But if they don't, then you can go the simpler route and just have an invisible object in the middle. And then we'll spawn it on that location. Alright. Now, let's get into the game mode. The game is going to spawn the revival platform, so we'll do the game mode first. Okay. The game mode is also going to have probably the majority of the work in this episode. In the base game mode BP, we want to basically make sure that we have all the references we need so that we can get the data we need to be able to perform calculations like where to spawn the revival platform. The way I do this is in my begin play of my base game mode BP, I scroll all the way over to the right. This is all stuff we did in other episodes. But at the very end, after I call set initial stock and everything, I have a new function I call set blast line references. So plus function, it'll open up for you automatically. I call it set blast line references. And what I do is I actually do have 3 variables that I made. They're just blast line BPs, left, right, top. You can make a bottom, you can make an array of blast line BPs and just assign, left is 0, right is 1, top is 2, and bottom is 3. Whatever you want to do. But basically in this function, I'm going to make sure that we're going to get all actors of class. We're going to make sure that the tag is correct. That way we know it is the correct blast line. And then we're going to set the references. You don't technically have to do this and set the references if you don't want to. But I feel like it's easier to just use those variables to calculate the midpoint of the level than it is to get the blast lines every single time over and over again. So for that, in our set blast line references function we just made, I'm going to do get all actors of class, and you can do the actor class as blast line BP. Okay, we're already doing that above, but just so you see how that works. And now this has all of our blast lines, so there should be 4 on a map, but we need to determine which one is which, while they're the same actor class. So you can drag off of the out actors, do a for each loop. I did one with break because, if we found them all and we had extras, we could break, but it's not necessary for now. Okay, then from the for loop, I do the same logic for everything else you see here. So basically, I pull off of the current blast line and I look for the blast line type, which is the variable that we just made, the string. I get it, and then I drag off of the variable we got. Say equals, say equals string right here. And then I just check for each one that we care about. So for right now, we care about left. So is this the left blast line? And we do a branch. If it is the left blast line, we're going to set the left blast line ref variable to the array element. If it's not, we're just going to continue along and go to the next check. We don't have to do anything else. So we check if it's right, if the string is right. If that's incorrect, then we're going to go to the next one. But if it's correct and it's true, then we're going to set the right blast line reference. Still off the same array element. And then lastly, we check if it's top, and if it is, we set the top blast line reference. Alright, so there we go. That's setting up all the references. Again, not entirely necessary, that function, but it is important that we either have references or we have an easy way to get them. So this was in the completed section at the very end of begin play. I'm going to scroll all the way back, and this is the respawn player event. So once we made it in the code in the SSB template game mode.h, we made a blueprint implementable event. So we can go ahead and, assuming we built and compiled in Unreal correctly, we can right click and search for the event name, which is respawn player, and you'll find event respawn player. It has a player number variable that we added, so we can use that as well. And here all we're really going to do is figure out where we want to respawn the revival platform. That's the most important thing for today's episode. There's plenty other things we can do, but for now, that's the biggest thing. So, first things first, I have to figure out what player it is that we're going to attach to the platform and make them ride it. Whether we're doing anything with their movement, just disabling it while it's coming down, whatever. We do need to know what character it is. So, the whole thing with the player number is that these players are ordered by their player number. So if I get the correct player number, I will have the correct player that just died. I can do my players array, which resides in the game mode, so you can do it without making any changes to the game mode. And then drag off and type get, a copy, and drag in the player number. This will get the current character / player that fell off the map or got launched off the map. Then we need our other function now. So I made one other function for today's episode. I called it get revival platform spawn location. So It's a little bit of a loaded function name. Basically what's happening here is I'm going to check against all of the blast lines that we need, and I'm going to get the spawn location for the revival platform. Now, this is a little bit overkill. We don't really need to do this, but I just did it to be completely safe during this episode because I wanted to make sure everything was good. You know, I checked everything was good, and then I just never reverted them back. So just be aware, you don't have to have 3 validated checks here. But if you want to, I'll show you how. So we're going to do an isValid check on each of our object or actor references here. So our left blast line reference, right blast line reference, and top blast line reference. Basically, you can drag these onto the screen, get them, right-click, and convert to validated get. You'll get this node where only things will fire if they come out of the isValid end. Well, and this is valid, meaning we set it and it's not empty. Alright, so I've actually done that for all 3. Again, it's completely unnecessary, but the process we're going to be doing here is the same for everybody. So we're going to drag off of this, and we're going to type get actor location. It's going to bring up a vector as a return value. We only want certain values from each one. So for the left and right blast lines, we want the Y value because that's the horizontal value. If you're not sure, you can look at your level and look at the axis down here. You can see that Y, the green one, is my left and right. So for my left and right blast line, I only care about Y. But for the top blast line, remember, that's where I need to spawn the revival platform, how high up. So I actually care about the Z, which is the height in this case. So I can right-click on Get Actor Location and split Struct Pin to access the specific values that I want. I've done that for all 3. Left, right, top. For left and right, I use the Y value. And for top, I use the Z value. And we're going to do a little bit of math here to basically find the midpoint of the level. Now, we can do this a bunch of different ways, and this might actually end up changing to adjust for certain other things, so take this with a grain of salt for now. It'll be the same basic idea regardless, but my point is this could change a little bit as far as where the revival platforms are spawned. For now, I just kind of spawned them in as close to the middle as I could for good measure. Alright, so I'm going to basically find the midpoint by adding the actor location Y's up of the left and right blast line. Think about it. So we're trying to find the middle. Say we have one blast line at 2, another blast line at 6. We add them together, and we get 8. We divide that by 2, and since it's faster to multiply in coding than divide, then we multiply by 0.5 instead, which is the same as dividing by 2. So we divide that by 2, and we end up getting 4 as the result. 4 is the midpoint between 2 and 6. Think about it. It takes 2 numbers to go from 2 to 4, 3, then 4, and then from 6 to 4, it takes 2 numbers, 5, then 4. So 4 is the midpoint, and this helps us get the midpoint. So there you go. That's why I'm doing this here. I'm adding the left blast line reference location, the right blast line reference location together. I'm then dragging off of, this is a float plus float, by the way. And then I'm dragging off float plus float to do float times float, this guy right here. And I'm multiplying by 0.5, or half of that. Alright. Then, yeah, we need to choose kind of where we want to get the depth from as well. Because the depth is also important. We want to make sure we spawn them at the correct location so that they're not in the background or too close to the foreground or anything like that. Now, the characters don't really change, but they're, you know how sometimes the characters can be hit onto the screen? Like, basically, they look like they get hit onto the camera and things like that. You could use the depth, you know, changing the depth to fix that. So I wanted to choose something reliable that will always be in the right position for, you know, the depth for the X value. so that we know what to spawn. And in this case, what I went with was the player start. Now you could make another variable or even a vector in your character and just store the basic value and do it there. You could have another object of reference. You could have it so that all that stuff with the launching onto the screen is strictly an animation and you're not moving the character at all. There's a lot of things you could do with it. For now, what I've done is I did get all actors of class, literally like this. I passed in the actor class as player start, because the player starts will not move, and I know that we're spawning the characters on them, so their location must be correct. Alright, then I pulled off of the array and just typed get, and I got a copy. All of the player starts are going to be on the same X value, so it doesn't matter which one we have. And surprise, surprise, I pulled off of this, get actor location, and then I split it again to grab the X value. So now we have a reliable X value, reliable Y value, and a reliable Z value. The Z value again comes from the top last line, so we know how high up to spawn the revival platform. Pass these all into a make vector. So make vector is basically any of these makes that you see. You can make a variable and pass in this data to it. So make vector. Click this and you'll get this node right here, and then pass in X, Y, Z. X from the player start, Y from the midpoint, Z from the top. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a return value to this. That way we kind of can have a transform to spawn the revival platform at. Because every time you spawn an actor, it requires a transform. So I'm just going to pass it a location. The rotation and scale are fine, but we do have to give it a transform regardless. So you can either make it now or once we're outside the function. Okay, so we have make vector here. And then again, you can do make transform right here. And then just pass in the return value to the location. Now you probably won't have return nodes yet because you probably don't have an output node or an output parameter. But if you click on either the start of the function here, or you can do it from clicking on the function right here, then you have these inputs, outputs. In outputs, I put output transform. So I added a new variable, called it output transform, and changed the type to be transform. Then I added a return node and passed in the return value for the make transform. Okay. And at this point, we're going to use that transform to spawn the revival platform actor BP. So the way this works is spawn actor from class, and we want to pick the correct class type, so revival platform BP, and then we want to use the transform from the function. You can set owner and things like that to the character if you want. I didn't feel the need to do that right now. Alright, now once we spawn the actor, we do need to access some of the stuff that it has. That way we know kind of what's going on here. So first of all, let's take a look at a revival platform BP before we go any farther. The way the revival platform works in this case, and there are so many ways you could do this. You could use splines, you could use interpolated movement, you could use forces, you could use a sequence, an actor sequence. There's so many things you could do. So I'm not going to try and tell you that this is the best way, but when I think of a static, like move from here to here in a given amount of time, and it's always going to be consistent, then I think of a spline. So the way I've set this up is I've made a new blueprint class. Okay, I went to functional blueprints, and I think I did it in objects, yep. So add new blueprints, blueprint class, and then I used an actor. Once you click that, you'll make this blueprint. You can go inside of it. You might have to hit open full blueprint editor here, and you'll get to the graph. Now, once you're in the graph, what we want to do is set up the components here that we're going to need to actually perform the drop down effect and to kind of block the player from being able to get off of it and different things like that. So you have this default scene route instantly without changing anything, and I'm going to make everything a child of that. There is a specific order and way that matters here, so be careful and pay attention to this. The default scene route can be the parent of everything. As you see, I close it, everything is gone. So everything's a child of this in some way. And I have two meshes, actually, that are, one's a child of the other, and then the spline is not a child of the one mesh. These are just two different components. Okay, that's important. If you make a spline the child of the mesh, then you are going to get some other results. Alright, so add component, static mesh right here. Or you can make a skeletal mesh if it's got animations. For my static mesh, I got a little bit fancy with it. And I can probably change this back now. I had intentionally put this the way that I did. That way you guys would understand kind of what it was and you could see it easily. But I did have a material that looked a little bit better for you guys. That way it fit in better, although I don't actually see it. This will have to do something like this. Okay, so make a static mesh. What I did was actually use the shape quad pyramid, which is a default shape in Unreal. Okay, it's part of starter content. And then I just gave it a material. You can use whatever's visible and whatever applies to the pyramid. And there you go. I just rotated it 180 degrees on the Y, that way it was upside down, and I shrank it down 0.5 on the scale, that way it was small like the platforms. Now I've actually added another mesh, so hear me out here. We have this static mesh, which is this whole quad pyramid thing, but we don't want this to be tangible, right? That's the term they use, which means we basically want to be able to walk through it. We don't want to be able to stand on it. Other than the player being brought down by the platform, we don't really want to stand on it or interact with it in any other way. So I've actually made the main mesh overlap all. Okay, this is the main static mesh. I made it overlap all in the collision in class defaults. Alright, now I've added another component, static mesh, as a child of this static mesh. I've called it attached location, which is a little, it's not exactly what we're doing, so the name isn't really important here, but I did give this one collision. Block all, it can be block all or block all dynamic, just make sure it blocks your character. And basically, this is just a plane that I put at the very top of the quad pyramid. That way, that is what the player stands on. Now, as soon as they exit the platform, whether they get off of it or a timer forces them off of it, we're going to destroy these things and they won't have collision at all. So it's not really going to be an issue. But we do want to make sure that while the player is still on it, other characters don't get blocked by it. So that is something we will have to handle, and we can't really handle that just yet with what we have. So don't worry about it for now. But just know that the collision presets on this attached location, which is plane I have on the top of this quad pyramid, should be block all or block all dynamic. Lastly, guys, and make sure it's not a child of your static mesh, remember. Okay, but we want to make another component, and I'm gonna search for spline. We want the regular spline. Now a spline looks like this. It's this little like white line with this little cube at the end. You can change the size of this willingly, and it will change the selected points data down here. Basically what a spline is it's a line or, you know, some sort of path that you can use to move things along. So you can move it based on a certain distance. You can add more curves. You can add these little like key frame, they're kind of like key spots on your spline. And you can actually have the spline, I think they're called spline points specifically. And you can actually have the spline turn and rotate and do loops and whatever you want. So they're really useful. In this case, I just need to use it to move an object along it, and it's going to be a straight path. So it's not a big deal here. You can either manually change it by clicking on the spline and then clicking on the white square here and moving this, and this will adjust it. Or you can just change the selected points to be a certain value. I found out that 1000 was about the perfect value for the effect I was going for, but you feel free to use whatever. I'm sure you'll have to play with it once we get this working. Okay, so we have our spline here, and we're going to have some logic that we're going to need in the event graph. It's pretty simple, but if you've never seen splines before, it's a little bit weird. Like I said, there's a ton of ways to do this. What we want to do is have an event. I call it start entrance animation. This is the entrance animation for the revival platform. So feel free to make a new event and call it this or whatever, and then use this. Now, what this is going to do is start the movement on the actual revival platform BP along the spline. The reason I'm not doing it on begin play or something like that is because I wanted to set the character reference as well as a few other things before I got started here. If I did this on begin play and I wasn't able to set those variables, they either weren't valid at the time when I was trying to use them or whatever, then it could either crash or it could just not have the right variables, so the references would be invalid and then it wouldn't do what we want to do. So I made a new event instead of using begin play, and I didn't want to use tick because it didn't have to fire all the time. And this is what we're going to call in the base game mode BP after we spawn it and set the data we need. So we're going to need to create, we made the event. We're also going to need a character reference variable here. So I just made a new variable, plus variable, and search for our character, SSB template character in this case, and grab the object reference. And the character reference here is really just to make it so we can make them move again once the animation is complete. You know, I don't even know if you have to wait until it goes the whole way down to be able to jump off. We got plenty of other logic to implement down the line though, for, you know, timers of it and things like that, where after 5 seconds it'll automatically disappear. So don't worry about it too much for now. It's not too important, the specific logic you have, but it is good to have the character reference in here, the character that's riding the revival platform. Okay, so I have my character reference variable. In my base game mode BP, after we spawn the actor, you can drag off the return value. This is the revival platform, and set character reference. You don't need the message, that's for an interface. You want to use the actual variable we made. So it'll look like this, and then you'll have to pass it, you know, the actual value for the character reference, which is the, for the player's array, the player that we got from the player number. Remember, this is accurate, this is valid, this will grab the player/character with that number associated with them. So we can just go ahead and pass that into the character reference here. Alright, and then once the character reference has been assigned, we can then call that event that we just made the start entrance animation. That's what I'm doing right here. Okay. Now, in start entrance animation, again, this is probably something you haven't seen before, so bear with me a bit. We're going to use a timeline to move this actor along the spline. The way this works is we can right click and do add new, add timeline. There it is. There it is. Not add new. Add timeline. Okay? You're going to click this. Now I already have one, so I'm going to try and make this as not confusing as possible, but timelines are pretty confusing the first time you see them. Basically, you have all these nodes on the left-hand side of the timeline. Play, play from start, stop, reverse, reverse from end, set new time. This is basically going to be calling this function on the timeline. Just play, or play from start, or stop the timeline, whatever. Okay, and then these are the returns, so for when it needs to tell us something. So update, so the new value, basically this is the tick of the timeline, and so, you know, every update you will get new information from the timeline about how long the actor is along the spline and different things like that. So that'll be useful. And then finished is when the actor moving along the spline has reached the end. There's a few other things as well, like direction, which we don't need here. Okay. So I don't need the timeline here, but what's important is when you double click onto it. So for example, we'll use this one. You can change the name here, by the way. Important, because otherwise it'll just be like timeline 1. Okay, you can double click on your timeline and it will bring up a graph. To make this as not confusing as possible, this graph is here basically to represent how far, so the value for, how far we are along the spline, or how far we should be along the spline versus the time that has passed. Now, it's a little bit hard for me to explain these things because there are certain things about them that I don't fully explain myself, so I'll just cut to the chase. Basically, we want to make this value of the timeline equal to how far we want the revival platform to fall down and move along the spline. We want to match it in both speed and time. So, it's a little bit tricky the first time you're doing it, but I'm going to help you out here. So this is our platform entrance timeline. That's what I called it. You can call it whatever you want. The name doesn't matter. It just matters that, you know what the timeline is for. Now, there's a very, very standard method to get the location at a distance along a spline that pretty much is one of the only ways to do it as far as Unreal supplies it, as far as I am aware. So the rest of this logic is going to be pretty simple once you're familiar with it. So let's do this first, and then you'll see what the spline and the timeline looks like, and then I'll show you how to change it and what to change. But when you're in here, you will need points. So what I like to do is just put 1 at 1, or at 0, 0, and then 1 at 1.0. I ended up changing it so that I had the length at 1.5, and I put the second node at 1.5. But you'll have no graph in here when you start, and I'll show you what that looks like. So let's say we're starting from scratch with our timeline. I can double click on this. I won't have a node in here. I can plus function here, add float track, and then you will get your graph. Okay? And then basically at this point, you're as free as you want to be. You can fully define your graph. You can do a sine curve, linear relationship, whatever. If you don't know what you want, like me, all I normally do is add a key value, right click and add key value right here, and then I add 1 and I set its value. You can always click on these key values at any point, and I set it to be time 0, value 0. So at 0 seconds we're 0 across the spline basically. It's not a direct relationship like that in the timeline, but you'll see kind of how it plays out. So for now, just kind of think of it like that. And then I like to add another value and just set the time at 1 second and value at 1 second. Okay, it doesn't really matter right now. It just matters that you have something there so that the timeline can actually fire and do stuff. Then I change the length to the longest value in my timeline. You don't have to do that, but if I'm using 1 second as the last value, then I'd like to use the length at 1. Then you can also change the name here. You can right click and rename where it says new track 0. This is important because this will change the variable. This will change the variable right here. Once you make a new track, which is when we added that float track and actually could see the graph, you get this float variable, which is basically how far along, it returns the value from the graph. The value being this. Remember, we set the time out to be 1 second. It's got a value of 1. Actually, apparently I never actually defined these to be 1 and 1. There you go. Whoops. So now it's at 0 seconds the value is 0, at 1 second the value is 1. And we've completed the graph. So the float value that you have here comes from the value field of the graph. You can change this name to change the name of that variable. Okay? And you can see that this changed the variable. So hopefully that explained timelines a little bit more. Again, I'm going to show you kind of how to change them as we wrap up here, but I'm going to delete that timeline for now. We don't need it anymore. And like I said, this next stuff, this is the rest of the stuff we need for the revival platform. This is very simple stuff, actually. It looks confusing at first, But this is pretty much the standard method. Epic will tell you this. You know, if you look up other tutorials, they should show you this. I learned this off of a tutorial. I can't remember which one. It might have been Ryan Laley. It might have been another Spline tutorial. But this is a normal strategy to actually get the distance along the spline. And I use it all the time for other projects that I have to work on. So this is not like something I came up with and I think it's brilliant. It's just pretty much the way you do these things on a spline. So this is important, and I'm just pointing that out. So in case you need to do other things on a spline in the future, you can use this fairly easily. So splines do require a timeline, which is the whole reason we set this up. At least they require it to do it the way we're doing it here. But what we have to do is get basically the entire length of the spline, how long we've been, you know, what the value is at the current spot in the time, how far along we've moved along the spline, and then we need to move the actor, the static mesh in this case, to the location, so I guess the component, not the actor, sorry. We need to move the component to the location of where it should be on the spline based on the timeline. That's what's going on here. Let's just get into it. It should hopefully make more sense. So, go ahead and drag your spline on from your component list and type get spline length. This will get you the total length along the spline. Whoops. Perfect. Now, we want to multiply that by the value that we have from the timeline. Doesn't matter what the variable name is here for what you have or any of that. It just matters. I'm going to change this from entrance time to entrance value. My apologies. Just to be a little ambiguous so we don't get confused on the variables. So it doesn't matter what this is, remember. Just take this, your return value here from your timeline, and do float times float. And use that as the one multiplication element, and then bring in the get spline length return value for the other. And at this point, we have the location, or really the distance that is going over the spline. So we have essentially how far along the spline we should be, but that we need a location in the real world, or at least in the level that we're in, to know where that corresponds to. Like in this viewport, sure, we have this huge line, so we're here on the spline, but we need to get the actual location in the world where that is at on the spline. And the way you do that is get location at distance along the spline. Alright, so you can either use the spline variable, the component that we used earlier, or just drag it on again, which is what I did, and then drag off of it and do get location at distance along the spline. And then pass in the float multiplication as the distance, and make sure the coordinate space is world. You could do local, but it won't work the same for how we're doing something like this. You definitely want world in this case because we want to know where the world location should be on the spline, or at this place on the spline. And that's where we're going to set the platform to. That way it updates over time. So now we have our location for where we want to set the static mesh. So it's go time. We want to grab the static mesh. This is the quad pyramid. And we want to do set world location. And then we want to pass in the location. Okay? And that will move the static mesh along the spline. Now the only thing that won't do is make it the way that you want it to be. You know, you might have to change the values around a little bit. So I played around with these a lot. Went into class defaults on the spline, and I was trying to get the right value. You know, it's tough, actually, to get everything the way you want it to be. What I like to do is play around with the spline in the viewport, which I've done here. And I ended up making everything 1,000 and liking it, but you don't have to do that. Just play around with the positions, you know, maybe some of these other values like the scale, and just play around with it. See how it looks, see what you like. Then once you're kind of happy with the general distance that you have to change the speed as well. So for example, my speed was way too low. I was, originally I left the length at 5. Okay? And it's important to note that you also have a duration here on the spline. So you can change these 2 durations to kind of get the right speed that you want. So the timeline itself has a length of 1.5. And so I decided that the time of 1.5 to go a value of 1, or essentially in this case, the entire length of the spline, was worth it to me. I thought 1.5 seconds to go the entire length of the spline was a good time. I thought that it felt right for the speed of the platform. I thought it felt fair. That way it's not like throwing the player as fast as possible and confusing everyone. So I like 1.5 seconds at a value of 1. That will mean that in 1.5 seconds, this platform comes all the way down. And we can take a look right now to confirm that. Comes from the sky, and it's done. Okay? And then once you do end up changing it, and it's a little hard to see because I changed it to the mesh material. Once you do end up changing it, we can go ahead and be satisfied with the timeline itself, but then on finished, I want to grab the character reference and set them to be able to move again. Because remember, when they die, we were setting them can move to be false in the SSB template character. So once the timeline is done and the animation is completed, the revival platform is all the way at the last point, then I set it to be where they can move. You can set it where they can move before that. It's up to you. That's just what I like to do. Now, there's actually a few things I did after the start entrance animation, and you could do them before as well, but they ended up working here, so I think I just left them. And these things are just a few things to make this game and to make this logic a little bit neater. That way, we run into less issues. So first of all, if you're jumping or falling, you can sometimes actually knock yourself off of the revival platform. Well, if we just stop all momentum, all movement, then when they die, it starts off as like a fresh slate. Then we don't have to worry about them falling off the platform. So what I want to do is get character movement, stop moving immediately. So this is, remember, the player number. Thing we set for the character reference and all this stuff. You can drag off of this and get character movement. Okay. And then once you have the character movement, you can drag off of that and do stop movement immediately. So, stop moving immediately is something that Timo taught me about. If your name has changed since then I apologize. But thank you so much for this great tip. Start movement immediately will basically cancel out any velocity or acceleration that your actor has. So, again, if they were getting launched off the side of the map, whatever, you stop movement immediately, and then they are just going to be exactly where you left them. Since they're already off screen at this point, because the blast lines are off screen, that doesn't really matter if they stop where they're at, so they can just stay in the air for all we care. But we spawned the revival platform, and we started the animation. We stopped the character's movement, and we just want to basically place the character where we want them to be on the platform. Now, right now, the character cannot move, so they can't, fall off the platform now. It'll look good. But what we do need is to make sure we use the attached location to spawn the actor in the right spot and also not in the platform that we spawn. So what I do is I take my revival platform BP, that's this blue line right here, and I grab my attached location. Attached location is actually my child mesh. It's my plane mesh that I put on top of the quad pyramid here. Okay? And we can change the color to make it a little bit more obvious. It's that green part right there. Alright. So I drag off of the revival platform BP. I get attached location. Scroll down, right here is the static mesh. Once you have that, we can get the world location of that, because that's actually where we want to put the character. We don't want to put them at the center of the quad pyramid. We actually want to put them at the center of the attached location. So, get world location. right here. Split it, right click and split. You have X, Y, and Z. And then we're going to, this is the player, one final time. Okay, we're going to say set actor location. Okay, and then you can right click on this one and split it. And the reason we're splitting it is because if we put it directly at the middle of the attached location, then your character will spawn inside the mesh, which we don't want. What we can do instead is just give it a generic offset, or really what it should be is an offset based on the character height, but we don't have that yet, so we can't really do that yet. And give it a generic offset that we know will work. The character will fall onto the platform, because the platform is blocking, and then it'll look like they've been riding the platform the whole time. So to the Z, which is my height, I did float plus float, added 100, turn that to a new location, so now I have X, Y of the attached location, and the Z location plus 100. Then I checked teleport. It's not necessary, but there are some things that teleport does that are good than just setting it. So for example, and you can read this if you want, but it doesn't really care about the physics or anything like that. It will literally just place you where it is, and we're not sweeping, so if the character is to get blocked during that move, it doesn't care. It'll just continue to put them over on the platform. And there you go, guys. So that was a lot of work, but now we have a revival platform, and I feel pretty darn good about it. It's set up pretty well to continue nicely in the future. And yeah, that's about all I got, guys. So now we can actually respawn our characters. If this helps you do that, please subscribe. It does more for me than anything else you can do, and it's completely free, so I just really appreciate it. In the next episode, we'll be covering cleaning up the platforms, the revival platforms, as well as offsetting the other ones if multiple players die at the same time. If you had any questions about this episode or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. We will be happy to help you out, get you all sorted. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon supporters and subscribers. Thank you guys so much for continuing to support me. Lastly, I do a programming stream every Friday, so if you want to check that out, right here on this channel, 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we do a side-scroller live stream. So you can ask me questions, we can just hang out and have a good time, and hopefully learn a thing or two. But that's all I got for you today, guys, so thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.